So thank you, Thomas. Briefly, I'm a 23-year veteran of the biopharma industry. I'm in the adjunct faculty at the University of Pennsylvania, lecturing in project portfolio management. And for the past nearly 14 years, I've been running project and portfolio value creation that provides training and consulting services in decision analysis and portfolio management. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. We'll move on to our next panelist. Let's start with the ladies. Elvira.
Hello, my name is Elvira. I'm going to keep this short. You can find everything you want to know about my profession when you stalk me on LinkedIn. I have a lot of experience in portfolio management, and I have worked in the bio industries, but mainly in crop protection, and recently also in non-profit management.
Thank you very much. Maithili, the stage is yours. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Thomas. Hi, everybody. I'm Maithili. I'm a senior portfolio and project manager at 23andMe. I come from a scientific background. I have a PhD in oncology, and I also did business certification from Harvard Business School. So in my day-to-day role at 23andMe, I manage drug discovery and drug development projects. I also play a critical role in portfolio management in partnership with our senior leadership. And I manage our collaboration with GSK. So I'm actively involved in alliance management as well as governance planning.
Great. Thank you very much. And Noel?
Thanks, Thomas. Hey, everybody. Noel Sobelman. I work with Change Logic. We work with senior leaders in established companies to help them accelerate their growth through innovation, and we have an emphasis on working with leaders to help them with the change management challenges they run into.
Perfect, thank you. And definitely last but not least, Mark.
Thanks, Thomas. Hey, Mark Christupolus here. Happy to be here. I'm currently at Sangamo Therapeutics working in portfolio management and genomic therapies. Prior to that, I've spent over 20 years in a variety of program portfolio management roles with Accenture and 13 years at Varian Medical Systems working across various portfolios in med device.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so very much for your introductions. And I'm so honored to have each of you here on the panel discussion today. I'll start off with the first question. So what are some of the biggest impediments to governance decision making, and what recommendations do you have to overcome them? Perhaps I'll forward this question directly first to our masterclass leader, Dr. Richard Bayney, and then each of you can have a go.
So thank you, Thomas. Two of the biggest impediments, not the only ones, but two of the biggest impediments is certainly A, lack of transparency and inconsistent use of decision criteria, and B, decisions that are taken without integrated alignment between the strategic plan, the portfolio plan, and the business plan. Those are the two major impediments that I've encountered for a very long period of time. To the second part of your question, what recommendations do I have to overcome them? I have one. And my recommendation is to basically implement a gated decision-making system that is consistent with maximization of risk-adjusted financial value. Now, that could be anything from risk-adjusted revenue through net income or cash flow. That is done in the context of the strategic portfolio and business plans. Or if you don't wish to only maximize risk-adjusted financial value, then there's really only one alternative, and that is to maximize utility. Utility being the combination of benefit, risk, cost, and time. And once again, to do that in the context of the strategic portfolio and business plans.
Thank you very much, Richard. Would anybody like to reflect upon that, or perhaps share their own response to the question?
Yeah, I'll build on Richard's point, and I agree that there needs to be more objectivity coming from the decision makers. So, too often we rely on spreadsheet models that are really making a guess, especially when there's high levels of uncertainty and you're looking at solutions that are further out. So, I think it was Scott Cook from Intuit that said, for every one of our failures, we had a spreadsheet that looked awesome, right? So So to overcome that, what we like to do working with our clients is to implement more of an agile approach to getting the customers, testing with customers, testing your biggest assumptions early with customers, and getting their feedback and getting more than just what they say, but what they do in terms of running experiments that produce evidence, which becomes a proof point for a decision. So if you have a complex business case, there's always assumptions that drive that. So zeroing in on those assumptions and running experiments to validate the biggest assumptions, the riskiest assumptions, as you move along between the gates or in an agile using an agile methodology.
Noel, thank you very much. Elvira, any ideas on that?
Maybe I can open up a slightly different angle. What I come often across to be a big issue is that as businesses and solutions integrate more and more, there is a request to take portfolio decisions in an integrated way across organizational boundaries. Whereas the boards that are set up for this then sometimes don't make that very easy. So still a lot of people are incentivized to optimize within their own department, whereas some of these solutions and the portfolio decisions require to take a stance that goes across, and it is more end to end. And then the governance structure isn't really helpful for that to happen.
Thank you very much, Elvira. Mark or Maithili?
Yeah, coming from a pharma background, I think the biggest impediment is not having a defined framework for governance. And this includes having a governance charter, which basically lists out all the roles and responsibilities of each person. This could be something similar to a RASI chart, where basically you are listing out who's responsible for the decision, who's accountable for it, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be informed. So this goes back to engaging all the right stakeholders, making sure you're getting the right buy-in from the people who need to implement on those decisions. And then also listing out the procedures and the policies which will be followed to make those decisions, to make sure there's a consistent framework. And just to add to that, again, from a pharmaceutical perspective, I think we often have multi-tiered governance with different layers. And if those layers are not congruent, it can lead to a lot of complexity in governance, and governance can actually become a roadblock for project teams to move forward. So we just need to make sure that governance doesn't fall on the critical path for these projects, that it's not an impediment, more like a facilitator, and that it's also adaptable. Sometimes governance is too complex for the size of the organization, so making sure it's tailor-made to fit the needs of the organization and the needs of the portfolio is quite critical from my perspective.
Maithili, thank you so much. Elvira, go ahead.
Yeah, that I think you've nicely illustrated also the point I made before, right? Because then when too many people need to assemble into a governance body, then and it turns into the United Nations, then portfolio decision making starts to become really, really difficult.
Yeah, I would say, just to add to that, I think getting the decision-making body correct, making sure you got the number of participants correct, but kind of, I think each person kind of touched upon the thing that I think is really important, is getting their buy-in to the process, the criteria, those decision-making criteria. Many times, I love Richard's answer. Many times I have walked in with a lot of structure and a lot of governance. And usually the smart people that are involved in decision making, I have find ways to circumvent it. These are typically the people that are at the top of their fields or top of their departments. These are smart people, and they know how to kind of I don't want to say manipulate, but they kind of work around the rules and kind of tee up proposals and tee up their perspectives in a way that is represents their point of view. They're able to kind of game and work around the governance quickly and easily. So frequently I have found the psychological aspect, taking that into account, getting their buy-in early, getting the criteria established early, and the how, so that people trust the process and they're not able to really, manipulate the numbers is critical.
Mark, thank you very much for reflecting upon that. Does anybody have any other sort of ideas before we move on to the second question of the session?
Yes, I just wanted
to... Sorry, go ahead, Richard.
Yes, I just wanted to reflect on Mark's point. Mark, you brought back some painful memories of me listening to these smart people in governance who would say in unison, I know the project lacks a robust NPV, but my goodness, it is so strategic to the portfolio.
Yes. Strategy.
Too many strategic decisions, you run into trouble. I was going to say it's helpful to get the governance team together, lock them in a room, and to say, what are we going to happen when somebody circumvents the approach that we agreed to? Because so if you outline, there's situations that typically happen, and you basically agree on how are we going to make decisions? Is it unanimous? Is it is it a consensus process? And what happens when there's who breaks the tie?
Yes.
So the working out some of those behaviors up front, and then when you run into them during actual reviews, then you can hold each other accountable for what you agreed upon early on when you rolled out the process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. I'd also just like to remind our audience to ask any questions they have, and they can also ask them specifically to people, and I will forward those live as well right now. We'll move on to the next question as of right now. So what challenges do you frequently encounter in the area of portfolio selection, and how do you solve them? Anybody would like to start this conversation?
Did I go?
Sure, Elvira, happy to. Thank you.
And I'll link back to what Richard says. So for me, it is the lack of strategy. Portfolio management, when you are at the portfolio decision step, you are implementing strategy. And what happens sometimes is that, again, the governance team isn't clear about strategy, or people figure out by trying to use strategic objectives as a guide to decision making that either the strategy isn't understood, or in some cases might not be as complete as everybody thinks it is.
Yeah, I love that, Elvira. Yeah, to that point, and to the point that Richard just made a moment ago, I have found strategy being abused in the portfolio process rather than really being used. At one organization I worked at previously, the strategy wasn't really well defined. It was more of an annual strategy, annual objectives, where the strategy we're gonna grow market share by this far in the next 12 months, or we're going to sell this many widgets in this region in the next 12 months. But it was more objectives than strategy. You can't really build a portfolio on that. So anyway, what it left was that strategy was up to interpretation. Every executive could kind of work their own strategy, and it's very difficult to build a robust process on top of that. But in places where I've seen where the strategy is shared, the top decision makers kind of get it, then you can kind of incorporate criteria around that into your process.
Yeah, Mark, I've even actually gone into clients where we one-on-one ask the individual leaders, what is your investment allocation? What are some of the strategic decisions that what is your strategy? What is your innovation strategy? And I can tell you more times than not, we get 5 different answers.
Yeah.
Just think of how confusing that's going to be to the organization if you're not communicating that effectively. The other thing I'd say that we found is that your strategy, you need to shape your portfolio so it matches the scale of your ambition. So if you have all these audacious goals, in 5 years you want to grow by some billions of dollars, or maybe it's more of a purpose-driven ambition. You need to make sure the bottoms-up portfolio that you're investing in matches the scale of that ambition, and often it does not. So portfolio management is about getting that. Part of it is about getting that alignment, matching your ambition, your strategic objectives to where you're putting your dollars and your scarce resources.
Yeah, and I think one challenge is most often people rely too much on their near-term goals, what they want to achieve in 1 year or 2 years. And it's more important to look long-term. Where do you want to be in terms of your long-term strategy for the company or the portfolio? and blending that in with not just the strategic insight, but also analytical tools. So there has to be a right balance and mix of using quantitative information as well as qualitative, more subjective decision-making to select the right portfolio.
Thank you very much.
So Thomas, if I could just round out the answers from the panel, the two challenges that I frequently encounter are, one, determining what's in and out of the portfolio. It's a hell of a lot easier for governance to determine what's in and far more difficult to determine what is out of the portfolio. And by out, I mean saying no to attractive investments, simply because you don't have the resources to do it, or even more difficult, saying no longer to investments that used to be attractive at a point in time. We in R&D have, in fact, a very fundamental handicap. And that is, despite how smart we are or pretend to be, we don't understand the sunk cost principle at all. There's nothing worse than hearing very smart R&D people say, well, we've already spent 20 million. Why don't we spend another 5 million? Throwing good money after a bad idea doesn't make that bad idea a better idea. We don't understand the financial sunk cost principle very well. Not to belabor the point, but the other challenge I frequently encountered is determining or agreeing to resource allocation across different sub-portfolios. Whether those sub-portfolios are therapy areas, crop segments, or consumer care business units. Because invariably every head of a crop unit or a business unit or a therapeutic area comes into the portfolio review and claims, I need 120% of the resources. And of course, that isn't feasible when you have multiple heads.
Yeah, and this is where enterprise tools really help out. So you can get the visibility, real-time visibility of where your constraints might be. And too often there's usually one or two bottleneck functions that really slow down the throughput of the entire pipeline. It's tough to manage this stuff in complex biopharma development when you're off of disconnected spreadsheets. So there's some value in enterprise tools to get to that dynamic planning, because as Richard said, you need to do that planning, but it's not an event. It needs to happen continuously throughout the year because the pace of change is just accelerating these days.
To that point, Noel, I found that we spend far too much attention to the budget and not enough to critical human functional resources. We should not dollarize or monetize people because of the idiosyncratic skill sets that we have. And as long as we can look at partial FTE allocation by project and then aggregate that at the level of the portfolio, we often find that in fact our most critical constraints are not money, it's people by functional specialty.
Yeah, I completely agree. For resource management, I've found I get far more bang for the buck, far more return on trying to identify resource constraints based on skill set rather than just strictly trying to roll up the dollars. Again, getting back to my gaming principle, a couple of times I was asked to try to just do all the resources according to dollars, and I found invariably we spent more time arguing over assumptions in headcount rates. You know, what rate did we apply to this FTE? What rate did we apply to the FTE? We end up spending hours trying to explain it to everybody because everyone's arguing about what is it loaded cost. You know, you get so much into accounting, it's just not worth it. Really, you're just trying to identify where you've got your constraints, and based on skill sets is really where the matter lies. Completely agree.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, Maithili, you go ahead.
Yeah, if I may add just one more point. I think what's also equally important is to do a thorough risk evaluation. And again, I'm speaking from a drug development perspective because the attrition rate of our portfolio is quite high. And we definitely need to consider the POS of getting from one stage to the other. And when we allocate resources, we need to keep that in mind, that there are some programs which are going to naturally attrit in our portfolio. And so that kind of planning is something that's often not taken into account when planning for portfolios.
Thank you, Maithili. Anybody else would like to make any final remarks on this question or anything that anybody else has mentioned? I think, okay, we're going to the next question, and that is, in the area of risk management, which processes and methodologies work well and which do not? Anybody eager to start us off? It's a difficult question.
I can start. I go back to customer experimentation and building the customer fact base into your processes to manage risks. So especially when there's high uncertainty in a new solution. So that means running low-cost customer experiments to de-risk, your leap of faith market, business model, or technology assumptions as early as possible. What we do is we map those assumptions on a simple 2x2. How critical is it, and how much unknown is there? So if in the upper right, the highly critical, highly unknown is the ones you should test first. And so once you prioritize those, you test those assumptions with customers and get evidence to validate or invalidate those riskiest assumptions. And then you rinse and repeat and keep doing that, especially in the early stages when there's lots of uncertainty.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to reflect upon that?
Yeah, one thing that works well, and this also applies to project management equally as it does to portfolio management, is to have a risk log and a risk register, which basically lists out all your risks. So you identify your risks, you measure the likelihood of those happening, what's the impact if those happen, and then you basically assign scores to each of those different risks and aggregate them and rank them. And by doing so, you can plot basically a portfolio risk matrix, which can help you define what are these different challenges that are coming up. These could be external risk, internal risks that are more specific to your company. And then in terms of external risk, COVID-19 is a great example where in terms of wet lab work, there was an impact on a majority of projects in our portfolio. And so trying to account for such uncertain situations and how would you respond to those situations is something that's quite critical in risk management.
Maithili, thank you for your insight. Richard, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, in my case, one of the biggest problems that I've seen in risk management is the awful disconnection between the target product profile and the risk assessment itself. Far too often I see a risk assessment for a potential drug or a potential product. And it bears very little connectivity with the hurdles of the target product profile that the team is trying to achieve. There are very basic hurdles that we try to overcome in a target product profile. And they're mainly around efficacy, safety and tolerability, dosage and administration. Those are the types of things that we really try to achieve. Most of the risk assessments I see are guided in fact, by industry benchmarks, phase-specific industry benchmarks that have no idiosyncratic value to anyone's project. They are, on the average, widely disseminated across therapy areas. They are an aggregation of disease states, and no one knows why the project failed or succeeded. So while I find that industry benchmarks are better than having nothing, in fact, to do a risk analysis, I am much more a fan of doing a bottoms-up risk decomposition that starts with the target product profile and uses that to orient you to distinguish between your controllable and your largely uncontrollable risks that you can then aggregate into a probability of success.
Thank you, Richard, for your wise thoughts. Mark, you looked like you had something.
No, I like that, Richard. Thank you. And to the other two speakers as well, I think I have found that anytime I start doing a detailed analysis of the risks, sometimes we end up missing some of the big picture risks. And so using a technique like Noel, you highlighted, I found that it is able to address some of the issues that Richard brought up. And only then I'm able to kind of get to a detailed process like Maithili talked about. So what I'm saying is just by having a conversation about what are you worried about, what's keeping you up, what are you really worried about? Where are major unknowns? Sometimes I found my executive team, there's some major unknowns that they're not even aware of until they actually have a conversation and actually think about it and kind of almost greenfield conversation around where are your biggest nervous areas of where we just don't, where pockets of lack of knowledge, capturing those, and then addressing using some other technique like potential future scenario planning, those kinds of things to try to address the risks. That's the only way I've been able to find to actually tackle some of these gnarly areas that I found that detailed analysis just can't get to.
Yeah, and that ties back to your earlier question about governance. I think it's the job of the leadership team to help surface those major unknowns. And instead of asking, when will I see the ROI? What did you learn? What did you learn from the customer about the viability of the solution? What did you test? Your riskiest assumptions with the customer early on, especially so they can reinforce that discipline. The leadership can reinforce that discipline with the teams at a gate review or a design review or anything like that.
For senior executives, I'll open it up for you guys to offer. From my experience from senior executives, they're uncomfortable talking about what they don't know. We all are very comfortable in talking about what we do know. And our brains just naturally go that way. It's difficult to dwell on what we don't know. It's dicey, it's uncomfortable. And I find that by going there slowly and trying to push a little bit, can we actually start talking about, get people comfortable, talk about what they actually don't know?
That's a great point. And just to expand on that, and also expanding again beyond the scope of this risk management topic is also opportunity management. There are uncertainties in terms of negative fashion, so risk, or there could be positive opportunities as well. And so just as you would design a strategy to manage those risks, you need to design a strategy to foresee and then identify a response to those opportunities. So you would basically either avoid or accept those risks or reduce those risks. Similar to that fashion, when opportunities arise for the portfolio as a whole, you need to design a strategy to either exploit those opportunities, enhance them, or reject them, depending on where your strategy lies in the organization.
Maithili, thank you. Anybody else have any thoughts before we end off the question? Looks like that's a no. I'll move on to the final question, and then perhaps we can have a slightly open conversation. Where do you see the biggest gaps in organizational portfolio management capabilities?
So should I go? I would start with resource management because I couldn't agree more to anything that was said by my colleagues here on the importance of resource management to create the container and the boundary to tell everybody where you are at the end of your capacity, both in terms of how many hands we are talking about here, but also what is the depth of the skill and the capability we need here, the competency. And then my second is my hobby horse again, that is the understanding and the common understanding or the same understanding of the strategy that is formulated in a way that we can actually use it to create attributes, categories, and in the portfolio process in order to help people to understand how do the single parts contribute to the greater good. And then thirdly, the decision-making skills, clarity of roles, and an understanding that decision-making isn't three men in a room applying their gut feel, that it requires quite a bit of applied skills, should I say.
Thank you, Elvira, for starting us off there. Gentlemen, would you like to say something? Mark, perhaps?
I love Elvira's response. Yeah, I've spent many times at various companies I've worked for trying to break that 3 men in a room, going with their gut feel model. Many times making it more than just men in the room, bringing in a little bit of diversity in the decision making, number one, but then also just widening a little bit and bringing some construct. One of the biggest gaps I would say is resource management. I think is so critical. Many times I get asked as I'm setting up a portfolio process, people Richard, you made an earlier point about deciding what's in versus out of the portfolio. I start off by saying, what is the resource pool that this process needs to sit on? Then once you decide the resource pool, then you can decide, many people would bring other projects, tangential projects that belong to other departments. Say, no, those projects belong to different resources. We're talking about how to allocate this resource pool. Say, for example, engineering, your engineering resources, and other projects from IT or from finance. They're talking about different resources. We're just talking about how to allocate our engineering resources. So I think resource management is key. But I'll go back to one of the things I started off with as well. A big gap that I've been spending a lot of my time on trying to improve within the portfolio management process is the human factor, the human psychological factor. I have spent so much time in trying to get executives onboarded with getting comfortable with the process. I've spent time in cultures where the company culture is very action oriented. Let's get to doing the thing. Let's stop talking about this. Let's just get to action. So many times I'm trying to make the process feel as agile and simple as possible, but at the same time trying to break that just gut feel decision making. So that gets into bias, that gets into trust, that gets into lots of touchy psychological factors, which is really, in my mind, bottom line, that's what portfolio theory is trying to do. Portfolio management process is trying to break the standard human bias in decision making and trying to bring some structure and governance to it.
Yeah, I'm going to pile on, and the first thing I thought of when you asked the question about gaps in capabilities, it gets back to resource management is very high, if not number one on the list for me. There's just a direct correlation to doing this well and time to market, schedule predictability, eliminating bottlenecks. So it's about managing for maximum throughput versus just loading up to capacity. And understanding where your downstream bottlenecks are and being proactive, as opposed to being in firefighting reactive mode when you hit a resource constraint. It just does so much. That discipline does so much to help improve throughput. The other one I bring up that hasn't been discussed much yet on this call is I get to sit in on a lot of portfolio reviews. And I just cringe when they resemble status meetings. Project teams are paraded in front of leadership and they give the red, green, yellow status update on where the project is. It just opens up for leadership to go in and tinker with the day-to-day project details versus making it a decision-making forum where the review starts with a set of questions about the portfolio that talk about strategic alignment and where are we relative to our goals. And you drive to a decision. All the analysis is done up front, and you might present some alternatives, and you come out of that meeting with a definitive decision about your priorities, or a decision to maybe add new projects to the portfolio, or say no to some things, which the point that was brought up earlier just doesn't happen enough.
Thank you, Noel. Before we end up the session, any other responses to the question?
Yes, there's a point that,
Go ahead,
I'm sorry, Maithili, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to say those are all great points. And one thing that I may add was one thing that's quite challenging is when we do all these portfolio reviews, you look at a snapshot of time and then the decisions are made based on what you see at that point of time. And what organizations more often lack is tracking the portfolio evolution and progress, and then comparing the decisions that you made last time to what you're making right now. And doing that even on a future consistent rolling basis is something that's quite critical, because you might be negating some decisions that you made not too long ago. And if you don't track your portfolio progress and evolution, you are basically making those decisions in a silo. And that's something that we should watch out for.
So Thomas and others, Maithili just stole my thunder, because that was the point I was going to make. What I have found is that many governance bodies, composed of some of the smartest people I can meet, make far too myopic a decision on the here and now. By the way, the here and now for most of these folks is actually the next 12 to 18 months. And as Noel quite correctly said, for a 10 to 15 year life cycle industry, there is something that is quite dangerous about that. You can, in fact, make a very value-adding discussion for the next 12 months that can inherently turn out to be immensely value destructive over the next 10 to 15 years. That is, I'll give you a good example of that. Why don't you just take everything that you're allocating to preclinical research and throw it into your life cycle management bucket so you can get the next LCM product out the door? That's a great strategy if all you care about is the next 12 to 18 months, but not in a 10 to 15-year life cycle industry. What we seem to lack is what I call temporal goals that are meaningful. So stated otherwise, what do you want to look like over the next 5, 10, 15 years? And what do you want to attain quantitatively? Not the hand-waving stuff that says we want to be number one. Well, look, find me a company that doesn't want to be number one. We all want to be number one. It's simply not possible. There's nothing wrong with being number 15 if you can clearly articulate what number 15 looks like. So I have no problem with temporal goals. I do have a problem with only making decisions in the context of the next 12 to 18 months when you're looking at a 10 to 15-year life cycle.
Yeah, I would add to that point, managing the longer term versus the immediate term, you need to confront the tension that goes along with that. So, and that's a leadership challenge. That's a behavioral thing that you can't delegate that. The most successful companies, that their CEOs confront that tension and address it with their teams and cascade down effective communications about that. So you can't delegate it. You have to confront it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Richard and Noel. Any other responses or thoughts before we wrap up the session for today? Or perhaps if you'd like to bring up something that you were speaking about before we went live with the stream.
I'm gonna shamelessly plug a study I'm doing, if it's okay, but just look me up on LinkedIn. I'm running a portfolio management capability study, trying to find correlations between some of the capabilities we talked about and actual performance of companies. So, and I'm happy to share the results with whoever takes this study. It's just a 10-minute survey, and so that's something that I'd invite the attendees to take a look at.
Great, thank you very much. Well, in that case, if there are no final remarks, I would like to thank each of you for joining me here today for the decision analysis session of the PPM webinar, our second session of 6 sessions that are going to be held over the next 2 months. And I'm so glad to be joined by such an international group of speakers who are also part of our PPM Summit World Tour that's happening in the first quarter of next year, first to half of the next year. And of course, Dr. Richard Bayney, who is hosting our Decision Analysis Masterclass coming up in just under 2 weeks. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining me here today.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks for having us.
It's been a great honor and pleasure. And see you all next time. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.